Um, Thank you very much for coming this evening. It's a lovely warm evening outside. We were going to do this talk in the cinema, where we often do our talks, but actually I decided it's such a nice evening that we do it up here, have the view outside, and have a great panel of speakers up here. I'm Ekow Eshun, I'm the director of the ICA. Just want to say thank you very much for coming this evening. Our talk this evening is called The Trouble with Society. It's contentious in as much as, well, what is the trouble with society? One of the answers to that may be that there are many things that persistently ail the world we live in, persistently ail the society we live in. And what I think part of the purpose of this evening is about trying to figure out some of the ways that one might address the condition of our times, to put it that way. So some of those ails, go from debt-driven consumption, social inequality, to popular anxieties about crime, about immigration. Traditionally, we've left the working out of how to resolve some of those issues to our politicians, which is to say, in fact, that grappling with those kind of problems, I suspect, will be as much of a challenge for the new government as it was for the last government. But I think the issue that I'd suggest is one of the things on the table here is that at a time when the traditional approaches to social laws proposed by the left and the right are failing to offer new answers, and by that I mean distinction between state intervention versus less regulation of the market. At a time when both of those seem to be failing to address some of those persistent problems, and some also those larger global problems from migration and climate change through to global economic meltdown. It's maybe not surprising that both main parties, in fact all three parties, are now emphasising the role of active citizenship as a potential model for greater individual empowerment in the face of these big challenges that face us. And certainly that's a subject that's been exercising a number of think tanks and policy groups from across the policy spectrum, from across the political spectrum. Many of whom are currently running research projects investigating the value of civic engagement as the means to a shared sense of endeavour and identity. And you can see that work taking place in groups from Demos and the IPPR on the left, through to Ian Duncan Smith's Centre for Social Justice, and even through to politically independent groups like the RSA with its Citizen Power Initiative. Not to mention, of course, some of the thinking that's been done by our speakers this evening. And in the time from conceiving this talk a few months ago to now, one of the things that's interesting is the shift in the balance of power that's taken place politically in the country. And one of the manifestations of that is that what was once a shiny manifesto idea in the form of the big society is now one of the centrepiece propositions of the new government, with its own government department, the Office for Civil Society, to implement those plans. But one of the questions, or some of the questions I want to raise this evening are, what does the big society look like? What does it mean to live according to the values of citizen ethics? What happens if we embrace citizen power? All of these being some of the buzzwords that are being talked about right now. And more than that, what has to change in politics and society for any of those ideas to become part of how we live, rather than just the latest modish policy idea? I'm joined by three distinguished guests to help address and answer some of those questions. On my far right, Mark Vernon is an author, journalist, and former Church of England priest. He's an honorary research fellow at Birkbeck and a founding member of the faculty of the School of Life in London, and the author of several books, including The Meaning of Friendship and After Atheism. To my immediate right, Stewart Wallis is the executive director of the New Economics Foundation, an independent think tank that aims to improve the quality of life by promoting innovative solutions that challenge mainstream thinking on economics, environment, and social issues. Prior to that, Stewart was international director of Oxfam and was responsible for all of Oxfam's policy, research, development, and emergency work worldwide, work for which he was awarded an OBE in 2002. And to my left is Phillip Blond, Director of Res Publica, and a Research Fellow at Nesta. Phillip's an internationally recognised political thinker and economic and cultural commentator. He's an advocate of a radical progressive Toryism, the case for which he puts in his book, Red Tory, which you'll be signing copies of after this talk, this evening. I'm going to ask each panel member to speak for about 5 minutes around some of these issues. We'll talk after that for a while on the panel, and obviously keen to open up to questions from all of us here as well. But Mark, what's up?
Great, well thank you for your welcome, and good evening. I have a lot of sympathy with the discussion of the big society as we had it in the general election and as it has begun to emerge before. But I have a worry about it too, and that is that given the present situation we're in, it seems to me at least as likely that it will lead to the greater fragmentation of our society. And the reason is because I think we've forgotten how to do community. And not least because of the economic pressures which we face. There's little sign that the government will either be able to either fund or even develop programs itself that help us to re-educate ourselves, if you like, into what it might be to live as parts of communities. Now, by this education, I don't just mean being equipped. We're equipped for our education system to function in markets and so on. I'm talking about a much broader sense of how we can re-expand our moral imaginations, if you like, to conceive of ourselves as different kinds of beings than we have done in recent decades. It's a sense of forging rather than equipping. I think this forgetting of community runs really very deep. If I think of the generation older than me, my sort of parents' generation, the baby boomer generation, I just about missed that. I think that there's been a lot of work done on that, about how the baby boomers, as it were, have, through kind of a neoliberal economics, have managed to do very well for themselves, but there's now big questions being asked about how they've done for community. My own generation too, and the generation beneath me, I think the sense in which we might have received a liberal education, an education which wasn't just about being skilled up in order to be inserted into the job market, has more or less disappeared. You have to work pretty hard in order to do what would be regarded as extracurricular activities. I ended up doing a philosophy degree, but I didn't actually do any philosophy until after I'd left secondary education because of the way things go. So it's at least 3 generations deep, this problem, I think. We see this, the evidence for this will be in the collapse of membership organisations like political parties, like the church, these old communities. There is this resurgence with, on the internet with social networking, and also with single issue groups, which are definitely growing, I think. But I think they're not really about communities, and we might want to pick that up. They're focused on single issues or very kind of instrumental interactions, just a click away, as it were. So if we're educating ourselves to be individuals rather than to be members of communities, I might like to ask kind of what does that look like? Let me just try and drill down for another couple of minutes on what that looks like. A very good point, I think, was made by Michael Sandel last year in his Wreath Lectures, when he talked about how in modern society we don't really share many civic spaces anymore. We might sit in the park together on a warm evening like this. But with relatively little wealth, you can buy yourself an awful lot of privacy in the modern world. You know, that you don't need so much money to pretty often take a taxi rather than take a bus, to buy private membership of a gym rather than go to a community gym. These areas where we kind of separate ourselves off, the gated community is often referred to, but that's perhaps a bit more glamorous, but I think it happens at a lower economic level, as it were. And the point about that is that we then forget how to be with other people. We don't go into the areas where we develop the civic virtues. This was Sandel's point. It was made a couple of centuries back, or a century ago more, by de Tocqueville when he made his famous journey around America. And he noted how democratic individuals very quickly buy into the idea that they can look after themselves pretty much. They can become self-sufficient. Democracy buys them, as it were, certain amounts of freedoms, and that enables them to imagine that they don't need other people very much. It seems to be endemic in democracies when they reach a certain stage of evolution. I've already talked a lot about how education is really focused on helping us to survive in markets. You see this now even with the new well-being initiatives, the initiatives that have been built around positive psychology and happiness and so on. It's nearly always driven by instrumental concerns. We're told to say thank you because it's good for us, that kind of idea, and that worries me. I think that in the area of friendship, which is the one I've written about more, we're encouraged to think we need sort of 12 friends, one to cry with, one to laugh with, one to have kids with, one to send our kids to school with. You know, they become the service providers in our life, and I think that's very endemic in the way we think about these things. To put it in, as philosophers might, we are very focused on utilitarian ethics, very focused on deontological ethics, kind of duty ethics. What we've almost completely lost a sense of is what philosophers would call virtue ethics. And just that V word itself and the deadening feel it has says it all, really. It's really the skills, the excellences which we would have, and more particularly the kind of narratives, the imagination, the sense of ourselves that we would have as part of people that live like this, as it were, rather than living like this. It's going to be, from Citizen Ethics, which is the project I was involved with, we're working very hard to think how we can contribute to just a real expansion of the kind of vocabulary in that area, which has almost died. So have I got hope? Not very much, actually. I think that things are going to get a lot worse, and then when we, out of desperation, realise that the individualistic society is eating itself, we might, if we're lucky, if it hasn't gone too far, we might be able to pick ourselves up a little bit and reimagine who we are as human beings. The modest amount of hope which I do have is that actually you don't have to think too much about what it is to be human in order to get a sense of the fact that what we owe others is at least as important as what we want for ourselves, and how we're connected with others is at least as important as how we want to thrive as individuals. Friendship, I think, is one way of doing that. The football might be another, but it comes and goes fairly fast. But I think probably things are going to get a lot worse, that society will continue to fragment, because we can sit as individuals and think, of course I belong to others, but there are these much bigger sort of forces at play that shape who we are, and I find it very hard to know how we can resist them. I think that, I'm sure Philip will pick this up, but a lot of the ideas around ownership and around systems just won't do it, because the bottom issue is this re-education of ourselves, this reimagination of what it is to be human, and I suspect that won't really come about.
Thank you very much, Mark. Stewart Wallis.
Thanks. Well, again, it's great to be here. I'm going to try your patience a bit, because in a week where you've heard nothing except football and economics, I'm going to talk more about economics. Can you hear me okay, by the way, at the back? Okay, great. Because basically, I believe that some of the things Mark's been talking about, this isn't the only reason, but at the heart of a lot of the trouble with society is an economic system that really doesn't work for us as human beings anymore. And I'm going to rise above all the issues to do with cuts, tax rises, those sort of issues, to go to the point, which is that we've lost sight of the systemic problems that we face, and some of which cause the current crisis we're in. And if we just return to business as usual, of course we need to get out of this awful recession, of course we need to get jobs back, but if we just return to business as usual and carry on as we were before the crash happened and before some other crises happened, we've got an economic and environmental tsunami heading our way. Why? Well, because there's four basic systemic problems with our economy. Firstly, we're running out of planet. It's not just the risks we're posing to runaway climate change, where we're currently on, as a planet, on track to a 4 degrees rise against industrial levels. That will cause all sorts of problems for societies across the world, and particularly for the most vulnerable. But all the work on ecosystems and ecosystem services, and the recent studies say about 15 out of our 25 key life support systems, water, fish, coral reefs, pollination systems, all those sort of things, are in severe peril. 15 out of 25. So we face a real problem in terms of, in effect, living beyond our planetary means. And it's happening very quickly. There's a measure, which I won't go into now, which is all about how many global hectares that each human being needs to live by, and are we living within our planetary limits. In the 1980s, we were living about in balance. We were about replenishing our ecosystems in terms of what we consumed and what got replenished. We're now living at 1.3 planets level. So we're living a third beyond the planet's carrying capacity. That's in just 30 years. We've never seen shifts like that in humankind. And when you shove it together with what's been happening on inequality, and you can see I get gloomy here, where at the beginning of the 20th century, worldwide, the gap between the poorest 20% on the planet and the richest 20% was about 5 to 1, might have been 8 to 1, nobody's quite sure. The end of the 20th century, it's 75 to 1. And when you look at London, for example, which happens to be the most unequal region in the UK, last year, the top 1.6% of people who earned over 200,000 took over 25% of the total income of Londoners. And when you start playing those things through and play through the research done by people like Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson in the book The Spirit Level, I thoroughly recommend to you, where they show that the highest level of most social ills in society are correlated not to poverty, not to wealth, they're correlated to inequality. So the more inequality, the more problems you have around crime, drug use, all those types of things, alcohol abuse, mental health problems. So there's a big problem there that we've got an economic system that's widening inequality at the minute. We've got an economic system that's supposedly been built for efficiency, but hasn't considered resilience, and all natural systems need a balance of two. As a result, we've neither got resilience or efficiency. You've seen that with the way the financial crisis rippled around the world and nearly brought the whole thing down. And finally, this issue of well-being. I do agree with Mark on the instrumentalism, but the economic thesis is an instrumental one, that more income equals more well-being. Well, it doesn't for many people on the planet. It does for some, and if you're poor, it really makes a difference. But some of the things that Mark was talking about are absolutely true. The economic system is not translating into greater well-being. Trust levels in the UK are lower than in 22 other European countries between young people aged 15, 24. We got the lowest out of 22 European countries. And our mental health rates, by some reckonings, 1 in 4 people are suffering from some type of mental health problem. I believe all those things are caused by an economic system that isn't at all meeting our human needs anymore. It's morally bust and it's practically bust. There are solutions to that. There isn't time to go into that. New Economics Foundation's been working on something called a Great Transition, which requires us to think very differently how we can improve our well-being within planetary limits and share things much more effectively and build a much stronger society at the same time. We can do it. But it does require us to keep asking 2 questions. What's possible and what's good? And that's where I'm totally on board with Mark. So where does that lead in big society? And we've just published something this week, which there'll be copies at the end, 10 big questions about the big society and 10 things you can do about it. I would say within the frame of everything, generally, the big society is a good thing. It's positive, it's going to be helpful. But I've got one very big concern, is it talks a lot about empowerment, it doesn't deal with equality. And I've just been talking about the big costs of equality. And fundamentally, yes, we need a transfer of power to wider systems, and we need people to take more actions in their own lives, and generally people do know what's best for them. So I'm supportive of all those things. But you cannot just devolve political power or democratic power and not devolve economic power. And if we don't empower people more economically and tackle all those issues, we're not going to solve the problems we face that's wrong with the economic system. And fundamentally, we don't just need strong civil society, we need a strong, not necessarily a big, but a strong and strategic state that addresses those inequalities, that provides the right incentives, that actually sets out in a democratic way where we need to get to, and supports those sectors we want to grow and not those sectors we want to grow. We've got a fundamental problem with our economic system. Citizens alone can't deal with it. It can help, but it'll be like moving forward on the one hand and dropping back on the other if we don't tackle the economic issues as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stewart. Phillip Blond.
Yes, well, where to begin? Let me begin with broad brush strokes and gradually, hopefully, move to finer points of detail. The reason I think that we're in a uniquely interesting time politically, socially and economically, not least in the UK and indeed in America, is that all of our current ideologies are demonstrably, manifestly bankrupt. They've all failed. It's as it were that they've been sort of outmoded by both internally and externally. And I think that nobody's really grasped that within politics at the moment. There's people on the left still talk sort of with deep nostalgia about the state without understanding why the state has manifestly failed to deliver. People on the right still think sort of 1981 will deliver sort of 1997, which then is confusing for them, but they don't go that far, but you take my point. State and market, let's look at that. Neither left nor right have the right solutions, and neither left nor right can deliver. What are the traditional mechanisms? Well, the traditional mechanisms of the left, as you all know, is the state. But the state seems unable to speak to poverty. It seems unable to be an efficient or an effective vehicle for tackling all of our ills. More and more money we pump in, the less and less we get out of it. You look at something like social workers, or police, or community aid organisations. The levels of bureaucracy and suspicion that are involved have taken huge slices of the increase in public money. Now, this then takes us to the issue with the right, and the right has followed a neoliberal model of economics, a pure form of individualism. But and this market hasn't delivered prosperity for all, open capitalism, hasn't distributed wealth. It's effectively converted the bottom half of society into a new form of serfdom. It's stripped them of ownership, so they have no access to capital, no stake in the world. It's converted them into a form of debt servitude. And it's converted the state into a form of debt servitude. And rather than funneling money downwards, it's pushed it upwards. Now, if you actually, a McKinsey report from the first quarter of this year put the total amount of British public sector debt, including personal, corporate and public sector, at 469% of GDP. That's the model on the basis of which we've had this putative growth. But what is it then? Why have both left and right failed? And nobody sort of answers this. And it came... and why have our politics of the left and the politics of the right come together and coalesced? And Blairism was clearly sort of a combination of a neoliberal cultural agenda with a neoliberal economic agenda. Well, it's because what's governed us for the last 30 years isn't political difference, it's the same solution. It's an extreme and perverse form of liberalism, which isn't to say liberalism itself is entirely invalidated. There are other traditions that I'll talk about. And that is that what our dominant actor for our political anthropology has been a falsehood. That is the non-societal individual, coming out of social contract theory, coming out of Rousseau. The idea that an individual is an autarky, it's self-forming, it doesn't emerge from wider social relationships. This figure then became essentially the key goal of the political theory associated with it, from Bentham to Mill. Now, the trouble is, if you have a society that's based on that model of individualism, you have a society that needs a very authoritarian state to police the outcome. Why? Because if you have a rights-based society that has no idea of anything that binds those right holders together, you need a permanent policeman in order to police their relationship, in order to see that rights don't intervene with one another. So actually we've been governed by what I call private libertarianism and public authoritarianism. They're the same phenomena. They're not different, they're not distinct. Statism and neoliberalism are the same thing. So when you hear the IEA or the Adam Smith Institute pontificate against the state, it's the state that makes their economy possible. And their economy is what makes the state necessary. So the whole kind of ideological settlement that we've experienced is not left or right. It's actually liberal, but it's a perverse form of liberalism that frees nobody and empowers very, very few people except the already well-positioned, the already well-educated, who capture both the state and the market for themselves. So that's why everything looks the same. It's because it is the same. Your phenomenology isn't lying to you. So what would a new politics be? A new politics would be one that wasn't like that. And what isn't statist or collectivist, and what isn't liberal, radical, sort of asocial liberalism? Well, it's the truth of our world. We are all individuals in relationship. That's where we came from. Indeed, to think of a human being emerging from outside of society is philosophically incoherent, epistemologically ridiculous, and ontologically untrue, but nonetheless, that's been how people have thought about it. So if we're individuals in relationship, this is the new lever of political transformation. This is the 21st century politics. This is the future, and left and right subtend from that. And this is beyond left and right because it undercuts both, though it can find its own particular ideological expression within both. And it also has its own ideological expression within liberalism, before it became perverse after Mill and Co. So, what is this? That is the big society. The big society is the new lever to express the power that only can come from working in association with others. What is this new political site? I call it free association, or I call or the civic settlement. And that is non-state groups freely associating in order to further the interests which they hold in common. Now, according to our contemporary denuded, pathologically stupid receptivity, as soon as you start talking about community, those on the left say, oh, it's fascism, and those on the right say, oh, it's Marxism, it's communism. It's an indication of how attenuated the conceptual structures are. But this idea of free association isn't about an imposition of a certain kind of absolute on a diverse society. It's the precondition of diverse society. It's what allows people to be diverse, because you're diverse in concord with others in order to create a permanent iteration or unfolding of the distinction that you take to be operative. So, for instance, trade unions. Trade unions were first formed sort of the latter part, the last 10 years really of the 19th century, and what it was and what that settlement was took another 30 or 40 years to finally reach a culmination. In Britain they took a wrong turn because they brought into sectional interest, but in the continent they didn't. They still were able to articulate a common interest. So this is the new settlement. And this is what we need to talk about what the politics could be. And I completely agree with Stewart. The main issue is for this to have a political economy. So what we must do is break down both the neoliberal market, which is essentially a market for vested interest, monopoly capture, and the use of rent-seeking behaviour by the winners, and make it a truly free market after what all the utopic right-wing thinkers from Hayek et al. Who wanted. What's interesting is how the work of Hayek, for example, was perverted by the Chicago School, so you produce monopolies when we were meant to have free economies. Nobody ever takes right-wing utopianism seriously. They think, oh, it must be Nazism. You know, but actually, if you read Hayek, if you read the critique that the right had of what was wrong with the collectivist European left, the right, what did they argue for on the right? What a free society? What is the precondition for a free society? Widely dispersed power, multiple centres of innovation, an idea that wealth and power were to be widely distributed as possible. The left, paradoxically, is the most antisocial position, because it can only think its society through being the same as. And what the left has inculcated is a personal libertarianism, so it's all about freedom within the private sphere or the sexual sphere, and any attempt to have any culture around that is viewed as punitive. But what it actually does on the social sphere is give all moral proxy to another actor, which then enforces conformity. And that's why you've had, in the Blairite inheritance, public sector target culture, making everyone perform to the same centralised standards, which gives you massive public sector inefficiency, together with this private sphere, which is sort of anything goes, a choice-rich zone where nobody tells you what you ought to choose, because all choices are equal. And therefore, I think that what's very interesting about this new centre of political action is it cuts left and right. because it produces a genuine prosperous economy, or at least promises, re-articulates what that would be. And it also produces a genuine society that balances both individuality and what we hold in common, and also has that contested and subjects it to democratic discernment. And that, I think, is the hope in the future. And the task for radical politics is, first of all, to not do the old rubbish again, but to actually genuinely think about this new sort of alternative actor for politics. And I think that's the future, and that's what hopefully we're talking about.
Good. Thank you very much, Philip. You come back on the last point you raised there, new centre of political action. What are the examples there?
Of what?
Of this new centre of political action? How has that been expressed?
Well, you might sort of say something, say on the left, London Citizens, which are a kind of a post-Saul Alinsky left-wing group, interestingly most endorsed by David Cameron, which was very funny, which led to Daily Mail editorials about why the Conservatives backing Marxist community organisers. But what is interesting about that movement in London Citizens is they put together people who are meant to hate each other. Jews with Muslims and Christians in communities where there's no other source of social capital. And if you read the Urban Areas Foundation, they go to the worst areas, and the only sites of social capital, predominantly for the most part that they find, are in religious spaces. So they build from there and form organisations around something in common. Much more interestingly, because I think for me that's still too statist an approach, is the idea of genuine bottom-up social organisation through social enterprises, through people who care about their estates, care about sort of what's happening to their children, and attempt to run services that actually meet the needs of those people. And what I think is transformative, and what I'm arguing for, and I think it's had some traction, in fact it's been adopted, is that those people have a political power to capture public money that's spent ineffectively on their area in order to spend it far more effectively through peer-to-peer social enterprises that have to pass certain standards of applicability, but they then use that money much more effectively. And lots of studies, prison reoffending, for instance, normal rates of prison reoffending, depending on where, are way over 50%. I was told last night it was 70% as the average, but let's call it 50. Blue Sky, who are a social enterprise tackling prisoner reoffending, gets those reoffending rates down to 15%. So social enterprises have massive, massive impact on one of our most difficult areas like crime. And that's the sort of way we need to start thinking, because these things are cultural and they can only be tackled by a similar cultural and economic approach. So these are hard examples of transformative behaviour. And the state doesn't work. The market doesn't work. We clearly need a new vehicle that uses both state and market mechanisms. So that would be...
Stewart, you concluded with the assertion that big society is strong in empowerment but weak on equality, and is flawed in that way. Are you convinced by what Philip said?
Well, I would certainly, share Philip's intent on wide dispersal of wealth and power. I think it's crucial, and I can also point, the Economics Foundation's work with community groups to create about 3,000 businesses in the most deprived communities in this country, and I've seen really good examples of communities taking action on their own behalf, starting to look after their old people, setting up, there's Marsh Farm Estate in Luton, which is one of the poorest estates in the country and got a bad record of, it's had riots and various other things. They've organised, they did an exercise, found they were spending something like £2 million a year on pretty bad takeaway food outside the area. They set up their own takeaway food, cooking it and serving it, and that employs 15 people and is, much better for the environment and for what everybody wants. So there's lots of examples like that, but you will not, at the minute, the concentration of economic power in a limited number of actors, whether we look at the banks or big companies, or whether we look at the monopolies Philip's talking about, they won't get changed by that sort of process. They will only get changed by state action. And this is where we got a real dilemma. So I think Philip and I might be pointing to the same end point is how we get there. And it's a real trouble. I totally agree with a lot of what he said about the state in recent years. But I've also, my days in development, I've seen some, I worked for Oxfam and World Bank and all sorts of things over my years. I've seen some states that actually have had really strategic policies, who've done it well, who've actually had industrial and financial sector policies. They haven't been worrying about macro money supply or Keynesian tax regime. They've actually focused on what do we want to achieve as a society. Some of them been democratic, some of them haven't. China's achieving a lot in a non-democratic way. So there's big problems how you get the state that is a truly strategic state. Because you see, I would argue we need big society, a strategic state, not big society, small state. We won't get economic power dispersed without a strategic state. And I wouldn't use free markets. I would use, we don't want managed markets on the one hand in a top-down way which doesn't work, but we don't want free markets on the other hand. We want open markets that people can have access to, and that's just different terminology for some things Philip's talked about. But you've got to intervene, there's been so much intervention to make the so-called free market so unfree. There's going to need to be a lot of intervention to get it back to a different stage. And people power will be part of it, but it can't be done alone. So I'm very pro the big society. I just think it needs to be accompanied by a strategic state.
I'm not a night watchman, Nozick, sort of small state thinker. I think that the state clearly has a role. I probably disagree with you on the state is the only thing that can break up a conglomerate. But we've got a report coming out shortly on competition law that I think will be a real game changer. And I'm a strong advocate of a real effective enforcement of competition law. And
but that's the state doing that, though.
Well, it's not the state doing it in the sense that it's law doing it.
Okay.
Which is slightly separate from the state because I think the role of the state is to provide the infrastructure for a free and plural society. And part of that infrastructure is breaking up monopolies. I agree with you. But the other way is to break up monopolies is to change consumer behaviour and essentially render them obsolete. And that can be done also. And I think there's also ways in which different capital frameworks can take place that can outcompete big monopolies as well. So I think you can use markets and you can use states and you can use citizen behaviour. They're all tools against concentrations of power.
Mark, Vernon, let's bring you in here. Philip's talking about a transformative shift in society. Stewart, you're saying that's notionally possible if you bring in certain levers together.
Yeah.
You talked about the ethics involved in that, the cultural shift that needs to take place. Are you convinced by what's being said here?
Well, at best, the cultural shift has got to happen at the same time, because I think the state or the law and various things can shift at a systemic level. But at the end of the day, the individuals functioning within those systems or seeking those new forms of ownership are the same kinds of individuals, and that will be the individual that primarily thinks about how to look after itself, a self-interested individual. So I think that, again, it comes back down to this question of re-educating who we think we are, and that can't happen in a 5-year policy or a 5-year term, or it is a generational effort, I think. Philip talks about how free markets are markets that embody trust, so that in order that people can take risks and so on without being too worried they're going to get stabbed in the back the whole time. And I'm sure that's absolutely right. But of course, in order to trust others, you need to have a sense that you belong to others. And that means that you've got to have a different sense of who we are as individuals. So I think it keeps coming back to this business of what we think we are as individuals. Similarly, with a lot of the local actions which take place, which are encouraging when they're seen as pilots, it becomes very difficult to scale them because they often rest on individuals that have a tremendous vision of what it is to be human. I live in Camberwell, and I know one project, a women's project, where essentially what it was a woman who had a tremendous ability to be a mother to a lot of other women who had really no good mothering roles in their lives, and so she helped them to become mothers themselves. But it depended very much on Georgina. and that's not scalable. We have ministers every so often coming to visit to try and work out how to scale it up, but it rests very much on her. Kids Company is a much better known example with Camilla Batmanjevic. I think that would be a similar example.
I think what Mark says is right. I mean, but what the most difficult thing is, what is culture change? I mean, I think I completely agree with him. We need cultural change. Yeah. I've always argued since I entered this arena that we need to recover a high culture. But the amount of hostility you get is really quite... What do you mean? Yeah. Well, by a high culture is something other... If we know what junk food is, and we know what good food is, we can also speak of junk culture. Yeah. And what's junk culture? Junk culture is non-transformative culture. It keeps its pro-status quo. It keeps everything as it is. Transformative culture is the notion of an ought, is the notion of another possibility, is the articulation of an alternative. So you could argue, if you look at human history, if you look at the history of the globe, what's interesting is a remarkable story of human stasis. You know, very, very hierarchical societies last for millennia. Then something amazing happens in Greece, something amazing happens in Israel, and the articulation of what Plato called the epikenia zousia, which is the good beyond being, which is 509b of the Republic, becomes allied with the Jewish Christian inheritance of a God that is beyond the transcendent, which is beyond the world. Those two moments of an objective order that isn't captured by an immanent order change everything. And you only see politics for the first time, which is the idea of an ought, which is the idea of something other than current practice emerge then. And so junk culture is something that doesn't give you another practice. Good culture gives you another practice. And here's I agree with Mark. And again, looking at human history, things don't change by big reversals unless you have revolutions. And virtually all revolutions are a disaster, really. I got George Bush's brother to agree with me. And I said, of course, the American one was by far the worst. That didn't proceed. But anyway, the point is that what you do is you introduce small-scale change and you ally concepts with practices. And those concepts are what goes to scale. And concepts go to scale and practices become the instantiation of them. And that's why you have to have both.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. We're all, I think, looking for the same sort of outcomes. It's a question really of the routes to get there, because I totally agree on junk culture to high culture. But when you look at, I live in North Devon. It's an area that's not terribly wealthy. And all sorts of social enterprises are set up. Some really good things happen on community. And there isn't enough demand. A new Tesco's opens, knocks them back. And it's very difficult. There's lots of things I don't totally agree with you, Mark. There are lots of people trying to change society, but they're up against very big forces to do so. And we've got to tackle some of those forces. Now, where I do totally agree is, I don't think business can change without either people demanding things very differently, your point, or the rules of the game being changed. I don't think governments will change the rules of the game or the laws or the playing field or the competition laws without people demanding things differently. So it does come down to us demanding things differently. But the problem is the social and economic modelling of the advertising power, for example. I would slap a tax on exploitative advertising pretty rapidly, and it would get a lot of extra money from the government.
Isn't all advertising exploitative?
No, some is informational. Some is I'm providing this service, but you have to distinguish between the two. But the power of the social modelling to go out and buy more things, I see it with my kids, to go out and consume more, and that's the route you're going to have, is terribly powerful. And there's been some very good studies in the US done on, there's about 20% of society who know things are absolutely wrong and are prepared to do something about it. There's about 60% of society that have an instinct that things are wrong, but actually the social modelling, the norms, the carrying on consuming, whatever, more and more, the next iPod or whatever it might be, is so strong that actually those other values win out. And there's about 20% of society in these studies that knows things are wrong and are very delighted they are, because it suits them very well. And it's very crude. But part of the task, if we take that thesis and we need to change the rules of the game and we need to pressurize things differently, it seems to me the only way through this is actually getting enough of that 20% that knows things are wrong and prepared to do something not just singing, playing in their different instruments, their different orchestras, different tunes, but starting to play their different instruments in one orchestra to one score. And that's blooming difficult.
It's difficult. It's the task of politics,
yeah,
which is the task of remaking the university.
I'm not arguing we shouldn't do it. I think we should.
Ready to take questions from the audience, and we have a roving microphone. Yeah, let's take one. That's fine. As long as those 2 minutes end in a question mark.
Neoliberal economics, multinationals with no national allegiances, financial speculation. These control the world. We are just called systems within that. So I'm listening with the two gentlemen on the left. And now I've got my question. The trouble with the concept of society is that it's ill-defined. In fact, put it another way, there are so many definitions depending on the context, on the boundary conditions. So I limit my question to kind of strictly a cracking egg apart, a local part. My question is about one particular definition of society, which is a privileged class of people in a community considered, at least by myself, that's my as superior. For example, a society that wants to allow debutantes to enter society, or which is, for example, the bullying club is a fine example at the moment. This rather ancient society was almost destroyed by the history of Margaret Thatcher. It is again under attack from inside, well, partly from inside, but mostly from outside, by a new creed called neoconservatism. This creed is full of willful irrationality and aggression, both military and verbal. My question really to Phillip is whether the old society conservative can defend itself against this new neoliberalism, or whether it will be destroyed. Neoliberalism, by the way, is the other leg of neoconservatism is the other leg of neoliberalism.
It's actually, you ended with a very interesting question. One of the interesting things, I think, when doing political history is nobody really does things for bad reasons, right? Well, very few. So neoliberals aren't evil. They didn't say, oh, I'm going to do X and Y because I derive pleasure from human suffering. It's actually a response and an over-response to the problems they saw with statism and collectivism. And that's why I said it's always important to take what people believe very seriously. Because often what they believe is actually quite laudable. So if you actually, again, read Hayek or even read Friedman, what they're trying to achieve is actually not unattractive. So one has to do that. And then you sort of understand sort of more exactly where it went wrong. Now, you're quite right. A market-based philosophy that purely believes in markets sits ill at ease with conservatism, because generally somebody who is just a libertarian doesn't really want to conserve anything. You can't really be a conservative and be an extreme libertarian. They're mutually contradictory and hostile philosophies. But you can be a radical Tory and believe in, I mean, Stewart calls it open markets, I'm quite happy with that. You can believe in the market mechanism. I believe in the market mechanism. But I believe that the market should value what is valuable and that access to markets should be open to all, and that people should have something other than to trade, other than their labour. Then markets can operate for the public good. I wouldn't like state control of restaurants, for example, you know, because the food's really awful. I know, I've been to Cuba, it's really, really bad, and you have to go to private homes to have beautiful food. But so the point would be is that good politics is about understanding where ideas come from and saying, if you really believe in markets, you should believe what I believe in. And I think a radical conservatism, a one-nation Toryism, what Disraeli never offered was a political economy for the poor. That's why the millions in this country who are pro-empire, pro-loyalist, organic view, if you think of the Primrose League, had more people, more members than the trade union movement. They all went left because the Conservatives offered working people nothing. And until the Conservatives can offer working people something, they will always be a group that's allied with an unrepresentative elite. But the old Tories were far more radical than the modern Whigs. So if you look at the 19th century and the 18th century, the old Conservative settlement was far more pro-poor, like the 10-hour bills that were, you know, the Manchester Liberals had all the mill towns where they were forcing women and kids to work, you know, 16, 18 hours a day. It was the Tories who came out of the anti-slavery campaign that was largely led by them, though not exclusively, and then said, well, there's white slavery as well, and this is taking place in our mill towns. And then again, Linda Colley's written a brilliant book called In Defiance of Oligarchy, and it's about the Conservatives in the 18th century. And a lot of those Tories were reciprocal landlords. So they had great vested power, but they also had an account of the duties they owed. And they fulfilled those duties, and they refused to enforce Whig-sponsored legislation and fines against the poor. So there's a radical pro-poor Tory tradition that kind of ended with Disraeli, was half taken up in the 20th century by people like Macmillan, and but Macmillan brought into the left's version of the Good Society rather than their own, but through the notion of a property-owning democracy. And that comes from Chesterton and Belloc's Catholic distributism. So I think there's a radical Tory tradition, and I don't think neoliberalism is included in it.
Thank you. Two questions, hopefully quite concise. I work for a free state-sponsored debt advice service targeted at financially excluded poor people. Now, what both Phillip and Stewart were saying about social enterprises, I agree with a bit of disbelief, because if, for example, a client comes to us and seeks debt advice, if we were a social enterprise, we would have an incentive to advise them on paying as much as possible towards their debts, which might not be in the interest of the client, because if that's assuming that we would get the money from as a share of their repayments, which is a common model. Only because we are state-sponsored can we act fully in the interest of the client, because we don't depend on any income from either the creditors or from the client. Okay, so I'd like to pose that challenge to you. The second question was mostly for Phillip. Your vision of a kind of radical libertarianism, a libertarian society where community groups can organize freely, that's applied in one country, like the UK. While some thinkers, I rely mostly here on Zizek, predict the future of capitalism to be with authoritarian capitalism in the form of China. How aren't you proposing a weakening of the state and one country in the face of a kind of global change to the capitalist system, which very much goes towards a kind of strong control over citizens?
Let's take those issues. Stewart, do you want to take that first one?
Yeah, the first one. Well, New Economics Foundations work with all sorts of both advice groups and community development finance organizations, credit unions, some of which are social enterprises, some of which aren't. And I'm totally I believe very strongly everybody should have a bank account, people should have much better access to credit, should be much greater transparency where the banks are lending our money and they're taking massive public subsidy in all sorts of ways I won't go into now to create it. So I would be very much on a radical agenda about how one tackles the whole issue of financial exclusion, debt, etc., and it's a big problem. I don't buy into, though, that only a state, a vice service, can provide neutral support. I think it so much depends on the ethics of different organizations. There's good social enterprises, there's bad social enterprises. It's what you set out to do, what's your purpose. And I think there are many organizations that have to earn some form of living, but who are not exploitative. There's others that have to earn some form of living that are highly exploitative. So it depends on your ethics, it depends a bit on your structure, I agree, but I've seen lots of social enterprises in the debt advice field, and some that are credit unions and CDF, community development finance organizations, and advice services, who offer neutral, really good advice. I'm sure there's some bad ones, but there's some very good people out there. It's possible. And there's all sorts of ways of linking up social enterprises with housing associations. There's all sorts of models that can work. But just because you're a social enterprise doesn't mean you're effective and good, or doesn't mean you're ripping people off. It's about what the motives, what the values are of the people, how you set it up. And so I don't buy it's a social enterprise. I do buy there's sometimes a problem.
Philip, the question to you was, if Britain transformed itself in the ways you suggest, we find ourselves on the wrong end of history?
Not at all. I mean, I think I wouldn't take whatever Zizek says about liberty seriously. He's a self-confessed Leninist, bless him. Charming, no doubt, but this isn't a man who's an enemy of authoritarianism. He loves authoritarianism. He advocates it. And why does he advocate it? He advocates it because he has a demonic view of capitalism. And so he falls into the picture I described earlier. An extreme authoritarian collectivism needs an extreme libertarian form of capitalism. That's how the game is played. And what's lost out is the civic middle. What I'm arguing for is, I think, the future for 21st century economics. If you look around the world, what zone of the world, leaving Africa aside, because that has other long-term structural problems, in the developed world, what area is most in trouble? It's Western Europe. And Western Europe has growth rates that are 0.1% to just under 1%. The rest of the world, like China, Brazil, 8, 9, 10, 11% growth in GDP. What are we locked into? We're locked into highly ineffective economic bureaucracies where transaction costs, compliance costs, audit costs essentially price out all of the profit and growth in our societies. All of those costs come from lack of trust. They're the costs of suspicion. And unless we have another economic renewal in the West, we're essentially economically in serious trouble. And so paradoxically, what we need for renewal is all the soft skills, the creation of new trust platforms, the creation of low-cost, kind of mutually sustaining and reciprocal relationships outside of contract. Because as soon as you have contract, of course in certain extreme cases you need it, we as a think tank, I try not to do contracts. And I try not to do contracts because if you have contracts, the level of time, energy and money you have to put into getting them right is a nightmare. And whenever you deal with charities or foundations, it's a nightmare dealing with them, endless hours of back and forth. Whereas if we have a client who wants a piece of work done, I just say, we'll do it, and we'll think it's good, and we'll keep doing it until you're happy with it. And that's what we do, and that's what works. And then until we can actually get this on a wider economic model, we're not going to innovate. And the innovations are going to be social as well as technological, creating networks that work. Yeah. Think of eBay, for example. Who would have ever thought that you could have a situation where a seller who's never met a buyer, the buyer would entrust money to a seller? Well, you do it because you have an open trust platform where your reputation is always worth more than the individual transaction. So the trusted vendor's reputation means that they can't gain the situation because they'll lose it. That's the model for the 21st century. That's what the politics of free association allows, and it's the future.
I'm worried about your Western European example, because if you compare, say, the Western Europe and US, Western Europe may have lower growth rates, but you look at certain societal problems.
Oh yeah, no, I don't deny that.
And therefore there is just because somebody is growing in GDP terms more, that's the wrong thing to be looking at. It can be necessary, but it's not missing the point, I would say.
Well, just to add as a sort of a kind of observation more than a point, I think you already see the tensions inherent in the big society versus the big state with the language of the new government. So, for example, on the one hand, one of the rallying calls from George Osborne has been, we're all in this together. That's a kind of big society call. But at the same time, we have the same, the declaration that the budget was fair, and fairness was the key issue. Now that's an individualistic comment, because fairness, when it comes to it, is about what's fair for me and how little I have to give up for other benefits. So it's devoid of this idea of what we owe to others. So that'd be one tension. Another tension, I think, you see in the debate around Trident. Trident is one particular issue, but it's very totemic. And it's particularly associated with the big state, and that's why the big state won't give it up. So your worries about an authoritarian China, at least on that front, I wouldn't worry too much. I think that people are very conscious of that.
The path we're on is totally unsustainable. The problem everybody faces is if you actually then try and do what people are arguing, that we can dematerialize our economy, there's no real evidence that you can do that. There's some evidence that technological change could be speeded up, but basically the choice seems to be running into ecological buffers or putting the brakes on and causing serious unemployment and social problems that go with it. Not a very appealing set of choices. What's the way through? Very basically, we have to decide which sectors of the economy we want to develop and build on. So I would build on, I'd do a huge amount on refurbishing our housing stock. That requires organisation at all sorts of levels to do it. Refurbishing our building stock, getting in green energy, getting certain types of manufacturing going again, skill-based manufacturing. We only employ 1% of our population in food growing. We actually have the potential for some 20% of the population to be involved in food to some extent. The craft tradition that's right back in terms of things we all want and want to be part of, and doing things with pride and with real skill. There's a whole range of things, but there's no question that if you're trying to live within ecological limits, you probably can't grow in 50 years at the same speed you want, and that requires probably sharing employment in a way that we haven't before. But is that necessarily a bad thing? In a rich nation, actually, I quite like more time with my kids, provided I've got enough means of living. I'd like more time to do stuff in my community, as well as working flat out doing whatever. And we are going to have to tax very different things. We're going to have a concept of productivity, which isn't about maximizing returns to capital. It's going to be about giving enough return to capital, but actually then creating enough employment per scarce use of natural ecosystems. We have to mentally shift through a radical change in our economy, but I'm very convinced, and we're doing an economic model at the minute to actually show how those paths are possible without the wheels falling off. It will require a transformation of our economy, a transformation of the incentives, and it will require us having a view of wanting things differently, wanting more time, more for relationships, more time for community, all those things. And that's not going to happen without some major pressure on governments by people, and it requires people coming together to do that. Otherwise the rules won't get changed. Sorry, it's a long-winded answer, but it's a complex question, that.
I don't have any problem with rebasing how we grow. So I'm not advocating not growing in ways that are sustainable and productive. But just to answer the question more appropriately, let me give you an example from banking. So in banking at the moment, there's no net lending to manufacturing, for example. All the money that's deposited by manufacturing is lent out to manufacturing. 90% of our GDP growth over the last growth period was financial services, housing and the public sector. That's no future for anybody. One of the reasons that real entrepreneurs and real economies and real businesses can't get money is because capital itself is monopolised. capital itself is centralised. And all capital, particularly disembodied capital, speculative capital, I'm not against speculation. I think any good society needs some elements of speculation. It's just the element has taken over the real economy in ours. Now goes to the City of London. Why does it go to the City of London? Because the City of London offers maximal return at minimum risk, which is what all capital seeks. Why does it do that? Because the state bails out the risk. If you work by Andrew Haldane, who's the head of monetary stability at the Bank of England, from 1900 to the early 1970s, the proportion of bank assets underwritten by the public sector stayed constant at roughly 50%. From the late 1970s up to now, that ratio has risen tenfold to 500%. So now the state underwrites 500% of banking liabilities. And essentially, through all the different types of insurance, deposit insurance, liquidity insurance, what the state has done is effectively insured investment banking activity. Yeah. And because it's done that, what it's actually done is massively increase the return for capital on investments because the state takes it out. Now, what that does is that centralises capital. That means capital doesn't give a damn about opening an aluminium smelting factory outside Newcastle that would be green and appropriate, but aluminium will still need smelting, you know. And it means that capital itself has no interest in investing anywhere in the country. And you can't rebalance an economy if you can't fund the infrastructure, if you can't fund the very businesses, because there's no capital to lend in. And so part of our response to the banking crisis is ill-judged. Like, increasing capital ratios is good, but the trouble with increasing capital ratios is that further diminishes the amount of capital that is being lent out. What we actually need, and this is why breaking up the banks would matter, is we need to break them up. But what's very important is we don't break them up in such a way that they're exactly the same form they already are, because the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, which are, you know, monopolies and mergers will take place. And we have no merger control at all. In fact, even in the EU, over the last 10 years, there were only 2 mergers that were opposed. So they'll go through and they'll just become the big 4 and the big 3 again. So what we need is to break them up into different types of institutions. We need to create a plural banking system. I've long been an advocate of a regional banking system. I've long been an advocate of using the post office infrastructure for that. I worked in Germany in the 50s. The growth rates, and I know, we need a different kind of growth, but I actually believe there still needs to be surplus, because all human activity generates surplus. That's part of what it is to be human. And there might be a surplus of leisure time, but it might also be a surplus of wealth. And the growth rates for the European economies were 4 to 4.5% from roughly sort of late 1940s up to mid-70s. That's called the European miracle. And the European miracle was precisely because they created a common interest so that people's savings didn't go off to state underwritten investment in goodness knows where, but were actually redirected to create the infrastructure for economic renewal. And until we can create the capital infrastructure for economic renewal, which I am arguing for, we cannot create genuine economic renewal. And make no mistake, and I'm again not against big business, I just think big business should cluster with small business. Because if we're about innovation, and we must be, one of the common themes of innovation is clustering. And clustering is the presence of large businesses with medium businesses and small businesses. That's absolutely key. But if you're in areas that have no large businesses, there's nothing there to cluster. It's one of the things that worries me. Plus also, the public sector. Again, the arguments for effective use of public money are strong and compelling. And the evidence is there that far better, this isn't a right-wing argument, it's just a true argument. The far better use can be made of public sector money if it's given to people at the front line who give a damn, who are working in a strong, often cooperative structure so that everything's transparent, everybody knows. They deliver rates of return that are phenomenal. Let me give you an example. Sandwell, the Sandwell Community Caring Trust, spun out as a charity from the local council. It now offers per bed social care at £328 per bed per week. The council's in-house care costs £658 per week. And that's impossible. It's not. It's attested. One of the reasons is rates of sickness have gone down from 22 days per year to 0.3. days per year without any of the workers' terms, conditions or pensions being undermined. Why is that? In part because these people own. Our public services essentially aren't good. They're not like idealised forms. They de-skill women, they pay people low wages, and they condemn them to a certain life forever. The sort of advocacy I'm arguing for, which is mutualisation of public services, would offer everybody who was previously a low-paid non-stakeholder a stake in the world. And that stake in the world meant that everybody in that company would have to take them seriously. They'd be reskilled, there'd be owners, there'd be deliverers of a service in a way that would be more effective and more efficient. And I've also argued that the savings they give to the public should be shared equally between the members and the state. And that's a win-win. And that's the sort of innovative thinking we need in both the public sector and the private sector. So there would be some examples. I think it's real.
So I guess one of the questions there is, what's the timescale for that type of transformation?
Well, I proposed, we wrote our paper in September. It was adopted by the Tories in February, and it's going to be enacted, I think, I mean, it's interesting because the coalition, the Lib Dems and Tories said, well, we must do mutualism. But I think it'll be enacted very, very quickly. You know, I'm hoping before Christmas. And then what you would then have is in any public service, you would have the right to mutualise it. And one of the things I was disappointed about in the budget speech was there wasn't these very stark and extreme cuts didn't seem to be accompanied by innovation. They didn't seem to be accompanied by we can do things differently. It was just looked, you can only deliver 25% savings in the way I've articulated. Yeah. You can't deliver 25% savings by contracting out. Contracting out generally delivers savings of between 12 to 15%. And that doesn't include the fact that most of that gaming comes from workers' wages. The wages of workers, though, then are picked up by tax credits, so the state gets even less of a return because they're paid more and people get higher tax credits. Yeah. So this is the only route, I think.
Mark, Vernon, I'll bring you in, because one of the things that's coming out from Phillip and from Stewart to some extent is a notion of an always-on individual, someone who's ready and prepared to take this active role in the new society that may or may not develop out of this. And I'm asking you, how realistic?
Well, that would be my question. I mean, when Phillip was talking about Sandwell there, he gave The Economist's description of what had happened. I wonder what would happen if a novelist went in there and started talking about the individuals that facilitated that and so on. And for me, you know, a lot of these cases, which are, they're hopeful, I don't doubt it, but I imagine they arise often out of very particular circumstances that cause, as it were, the individuals involved to think differently about what they want to do. Whether or not you can then roll that out across the whole state, I doubt, I guess, to be honest. The other thing, just to pick up on Philip's comment there about lack of innovation in the budget speech, the thing that occurred to me, you know, banging on about the need for education is, of course, that one of the departments which will be cut massively, one of the ones which is threatened with the 30% level, not just the 25% level, is, of course, education. And I suspect that will undermine a lot of the desire to otherwise make savings for the reasons Phillip just said.
Okay, look, we've got time for one or two more questions.
It's
Yes.
an ideal question, isn't it?
Yes.
Short, pithy, one sentence.
And the answer is yes. It's certainly, but I think like anything else, you want, in the banking sector as well, we want a diverse and mutual banking sector. So you will read some bigger institutions, you will need smaller institutions, but definitely. But I think we've always got to be clear that, you know, progress, creation of new businesses, new social enterprises, whatever they are, isn't just a factor of availability of funding. Availability of funding, we see, is very much only one part of the thing. The thing that really works, and where we've worked in really deprived ex-coal mining towns and things like that, is, first of all, where there's a community panel that actually is supporting any enterprise creation with people who've got really good local knowledge, and where there's a coaching approach that really helps people who want to start businesses, social enterprises, really explore the options in a very open way. We've seen that's much more important than the availability of finance per se. It's not saying finance isn't important, but you've got to get other things right first.
But I think, Stuart, one of the interesting about microfinance is that it works culturally.
That's why I'm saying yes.
It works culturally because its great resonance has been with women in third world countries.
Oh, yeah. I've worked in Bangladesh a lot and seen that.
Bangladeshi women, and it relies on very strong peer pressure.
Yeah.
There's been sort of some questions about it in the academic literature about how effective it really is at leveraging a sort of long-term change. And the work that comes back from that has been less optimistic. My sense is that it's like credit unions. Like credit unions, everyone talks about credit unions, financial exclusion. They actually don't seem to go to scale very well. The only area in Britain where credit unions have worked is in strong areas of strong peer pressure. The Catholic Church in Northern Ireland, for example, or the Protestant Church in Northern Ireland, because everybody wants to pay and pay back because they don't want people in the church thinking they don't pay their debts. And in our atomized societies, people don't pay back within those, so it then creates the business model is very compromised. Yeah. So I think that microfinance is part of the answer. It's not the whole answer.
Well, just to add that for peer pressure, that for Reed, public shaming. It's pretty tough, microfinancing.
Not necessarily, but it could be.
Inequality actually became worse because of the Thatcher government and because of the market-led reorientation of economic reforms in that period. So you had increased tendering to private companies, and that led to lower wages being given to people like cleaners and hospitality staff. And I think if we're serious about inequality, we have to have governments leading. Market social enterprise is actually coming tackle that. I'm not sure if actually really seriously addressed inequality. It wasn't an issue in the election. And there seems to be a reluctance to really raise that issue in the political arena because people become frightened of words like redistribution. We could actually increase change taxes and increase benefits to actually make sure that people very often work dirt poor. But also, if we're serious about empowering them and changing their lives, I think there's a lot of support, and no government's actually tried that. But I don't think it's the fact that the governments can't really continue with helping before. I don't think we're really seriously devising models that would actually enable them to do that.
Just if one goes onto our website, you'll see a report called Backing the Future on the New Economics Foundation website. And we did a study last year with Action for Children, used to be NCH, looking at what actually costing both the effects of inequality and particularly the costs to our society if we don't act of crime, various social problems, drug abuse, etc. That we calculated at around £4 trillion, not billion, not million, £4 trillion over the next 20 years. And we also showed that if there was early intervention, both on a targeted basis, but also universal childcare as a policy, and that requires government action, that would offset about 1.5 trillion of those costs by really acting early. Now that is something that requires a strategic state. It requires intervention, it requires incentives, but it also requires funding at a national level of universal childcare. And that's the key point I want to keep making. I do think all the things we're talking about on social enterprise, giving more power, is very crucial, but you're going to need state actions to deal with the inequalities, the in-power balances, etc. And that state action's got to be very different from the state action we've seen from either the last two sets of governments. Because basically the only government since 1979 that didn't increase inequality was the one of John Major. Thatcher governments increased inequality, so did Blair and Brown overall.
I think that it's very... Well, it's 60% of medium income.
No. Well, here we're talking about... No, I'm talking here more very specifically about income inequality. I agree there's many other forms of inequality and we need to tackle... No, it isn't. There's very strong evidence that income inequality in society is one of the highest correlators to all sorts of social ills.
Britain and the UK are the societies that are most rich with the rhetoric of equality of opportunity, but in the developed world are the least socially mobile. So I think there's no, but the point is, if you want reality, you have to deliver the real economic conditions for it. Otherwise, it's just a cover. But just to answer the issues. The answer to inequality is not increasing taxes and increasing benefits, because that destroys business. And I think that what people have to realise is all our wealth comes from business. All of our wealth, our public, our state, everything comes from the activity of the private sector. And I know the caveats you introduced, and I'm not going to, and I understand the role of the public, and I know, but I just want to make this point sort of in a starker way, without subtlety, in order to get us to start thinking differently. Now, the point is that for me, the wealth that business is and represents is too narrowly restricted. The only way for the poor to really stop being poor isn't more welfare, isn't higher taxes on the rich. It's they to become owners of their own enterprises and owners of their own businesses. Let me give you some examples from Harriet Harman's very good equality survey. When they study income inequality, and this is from, it was roughly depending how you define the household, single person, skilled person, two household, it varied roughly between 4 to 8 between the 90-10 decile, the bottom 10%, the top 10%. 4 to 8. When you looked at assets, wealth, the ratio was nearly 100 to 1. The top 10% own very close to 100 times more assets than the bottom 10%. Yep. Now, the only way the poor are going to get assets is if we do the public sector differently and we do private business differently. And the way for the poor, Muhammad Yunus said the poor have to make their own jobs. He's absolutely right. And why my vision, for what it's worth, for the poor, is the idea that they take control of the money spent on them. They take control, and we create the capacity, and they work in concert with an enabling or strategic, I quite like that term, state, and together with other enterprises to create the conditions where they have budgetary capture of the money spent on them. Because there's nothing so expensive as poverty, both in terms of the money that it costs the state and the money that isn't made. And from those, like social impact bonds. So social impact bonds are roughly, you assess the cost to the state of prisoner reoffending. You then calculate the difference savings that can be made if you stop people offending. And then you let people self-administer their own corrective. You create the cultural, local, civic businesses that can use social impact bonds to generate savings, which then provide their own economy. But also in the private sector, what we've got is to create, using welfare and using all the other mechanisms that we can, is a massive recapitalisation of the poor. One of the techniques, and I think Stewart might like this as well, is individual carbon trading accounts. If we have individual carbon trading accounts, the poor, because they don't fly, will suddenly, out of thin air, have a massive capital asset.
Totally agree.
That they can then trade with people who do fly. Now, I fly a lot, and they'd be like, oh, Christ. You know, and I like flying, I have to confess. It's rather marvellous. But the point is, it's a social good. But the point is, if it's a damaging social good, then in some sense, that damaging social good should be compensated for by those who don't behave in that manner. So we've got to think about ways that the poor can start running their own businesses, start having their own assets, because that's the source of all wealth. And we've got to stop, I'm not suggesting anyone here is doing that, we've got to stop either lauding the state and demonising business, or lauding business and demonising the state. They all have a role to play in the new settlement, and nobody, I think, should deny that.
I agree with 90% of that, but the idea that only business are wealth creators, I totally disagree with. There's a wonderful woman surgeon that some of you may have heard on Radio 4, I think last year, who was a heart surgeon. She said, I wait till I get them on the operating table of some of these businesses. And then I asked them the question, just before I put them under the knife, who's the wealth creator now? And I think that just sums it up, that we're creating wealth and a vision of human beings where wealth is all sorts of
That's
forms.
how the public sector works. The public sector originally comes from wealth, but it itself functions to generate more wealth. That's why we also need the public sector education.
Good. We're not going to agree entirely, and that's a healthy thing for a debate. Going to call time right now. I always think it's good to quit while we're ahead. I do want to say a real thank you to my panellists this evening, to Mark Vernon, to Stewart Wallis, who's got copies of 10 big questions about the big society pamphlet.
Yeah,
here,
you're welcome to take
if
you like.
And to Phillip Blond, who's signing copies of Red Tory downstairs in the bookshop.
In the bookshop, I guess.
And to thank you all very much for coming to the ICO this evening.
Thank you.